You know what they say, sometimes too much of a good thing is a bad thing because, it's just too much. So, hi, and welcome back to the 50/50 Project, where each week I talk through an item on a list made up of one thing I've learned for each year I've lived. This week, here we are back in the body category, which is the realm in which I probably struggle the most, as I think I mentioned the last time through back in episode 7. My advice then was to get more sleep, but this time I'm coming at habit formation from almost an opposite angle. With thing number 14, stop eating so much sugar. And I'm talking mostly to myself here. Please, self, eat less frickin' sugar. So let's talk about sugar and how much I love it. I love sugar more than sunshine and more than big fluffy dogs. I love sugar more than I love my favorite movie and more than I think I have ever loved any man. I love sugar in German chocolate cake, and I love it in caramel, and I love it in fudgesicles and in country time lemonade, and in those poisonous super sweet coffee creamers, that have names like Butterfinger Bomb and cinnamon rolled cheesecake cookie cake ball. I love sugar in Starbucks, but I also love it in Starbursts and in Twizzlers and in Reese's peanut butter cups and in any sort of M&M limited edition flavor. And Mars Incorporated, if you are listening, for the love of God, bring back the Valentine's Day chocolate cherry version, please and thank you. And that reminds me, I love sugar most recently in these absolutely terrible Kroger brand, chewy, gummy, gross, cherry sour candies, which I blame my friend Crystal for in bringing that to my attention by posting about how truly awful they are. And they were awful. But that doesn't matter to me because if it's more than 50% sugar, and bonus points if there's also a lot of carcinogenic food coloring in it, I will fall in love with it. I even love Mounds bars. Everybody hates Mounds bars. The only exceptions I've found so far in my entire life have been candy corn and those godforsaken orange circus peanuts. So I'm not sure if you could tell from that, but I have a very, very hard time resisting sugar. As far as I can tell, the jury is still out on the legitimacy of sugar addiction as it compares to other substances. And I'm not really qualified to have a strong opinion on that. But what I know for sure is that I really, really, really struggle to eat sugar in anything even approximating moderation. And unfortunately, I think that's been detrimental to my health over the years. I've known for a long time that overconsumption of sugar can contribute to struggles with weight, and it can up the risk of diabetes. But in recent years, I've been doing more reading up on it, and I've been surprised and horrified to learn that too much sugar can go right at cardiovascular health, it can wreak havoc on the liver, it can even contribute to systemic inflammation. It can be really hard on the body, especially if you consume it at the levels that I, left to my own inclinations, will consume it. So I've been trying for a few years now to really get a handle on this unhealthy proclivity of mine. And I swear to you, it's one of the hardest things I have ever struggled with. So over the past several years, I have found a couple strategies that can help me with this very specific issue. And while I don't know that these are broadly applicable as nuggets of wisdom, I think they might help some of my fellow sugar sufferers, so I'll go ahead and unpack them a bit. First, I have banished sugary drinks from my fridge and replaced them with unflavored seltzer water. And now I drink an absolutely ungodly amount of plain seltzer water. And of course, I'm waiting for the study that comes out to say that seltzer water eventually makes your toes fall off or something, because it's always something. But for the time being, the fizz makes it so much more pleasant for me than flat water has ever been. And because I get that fizzy texture, I think it means that I just miss the flavor less. So despite the fact that I hear it's tough on teeth enamel, seltzer water has been a good swap for me in place of soda or sweet tea or lemonade or juice. And that has helped me cut my sugar intake pretty significantly overall. And my point is not to demonize any one type of food, and I'm certainly not trying to convince others to cut out soda, but I'm just saying for me personally, it was helpful to identify a category of food that I wanted to limit and to find a swap that could help me make that happen. Second, I try to make similar kinds of swaps in my other snack choices. I usually will try to choose something that's at least a little healthier than the thing I really want. I've found that bananas are kind of amazing as stand-ins for refined sugar in baked goods. And I make a cookie actually by mashing, almost liquefying a couple bananas and a cup or so of quick cook oats and some good quality dark chocolate. Sometimes I throw some chopped walnuts or pecans in there if I'm feeling wild. Is there still some refined sugar in the chocolate? Yeah, there is. But is that a better choice than a typical chocolate chip cookie for me? I think it is. And because it's something that I made in my own kitchen, I know exactly what's in it. And because it's something I made in my own kitchen, it's just not as good as a box of cookies from the bakery would be. So I'm more likely to be able to control the number of them that I cram into my maw on any given day. So I have to say that getting a handle on sugar is an ongoing struggle for me. And I don't have as many successful strategies as I wish I did. But those are a couple that are very specific to this particular problem that have helped me out. But man, I have to say it still remains a terrible, terrible daily struggle. It really does. And I think this is in part because I'm trying to form a habit of subtraction here. I'm trying to remove or at least limit something from my life instead of adding or increasing something. I talked a little bit about this in the sleep episode, in that I think it's just more challenging to move in one direction than the other. And in my experience, it's somewhat easier to add in sleep than it has been to subtract sugar. And I think that's because when you're trying to form a habit of addition, it's often, not always, but often, it's a hill you only have to get over once per day. If I want to eat a salad every day, I only have to force myself to eat that salad once in order to check that box and have a quote unquote successful day on this front and move on until the next day when I have to cross that hill again. But forming a habit of subtraction is trickier, in my opinion, because it's kind of a tide you have to swim against all damn day. If my goal is to eat less sugar, I can decline to eat anything sweet with breakfast, say, and that's great, but I'm still not off the hook. I have to try to avoid sugar in my lunch, in my dinner, not to mention the other 1,001 times a day when the idea of a sugary snack will pop into my head completely unbidden. So I think it's just a more exhausting challenge for me to take stuff out than it is for me to add it in. I think maybe the most important thing, maybe the only really helpful thing I have learned about forming habits of subtraction is that strict perfectionism really is not my friend in that process. I think perfectionism isn't all that helpful in life in general, but I will admit that it has its uses in forming a habit of addition sometimes. It can help to adopt a hell or high water kind of attitude toward doing something and staying really intense about it until it's done for the day, and then you can relax. But because a habit of subtraction, again, can't be crossed off the list in the same way, going hardcore like that is at best exhausting, and at worst, it can be really counterproductive. In the past, before I figured this out, I would go into my day determined to stringently limit the amount of sugar I ate. And then on most days, when I slipped up, I added a dollop of creamer to my coffee, or I broke down and had a second square of dark chocolate after lunch. Well, it felt like the wheels had completely come off the wagon. And that's never a good feeling. It's not a healthy thing for me to set myself up to feel like a failure most days of the week. And for me, it also triggers a really self-destructive tendency to just throw up my hands and act like the entire project is off for the day and I'll just have to start again tomorrow because today has been ruined. Today is no longer a perfect execution. And of course, since today has been ruined, I might as well eat enough bad cherry sours to make my throat bleed, right? And in that way, teeny tiny deviations from the plan can become major detours. So I've learned that, particularly when I'm trying to form a habit of subtraction, I cannot take a perfectionistic approach. Instead, I have to say, okay, that wasn't the plan. And then I have to also say, okay, it's not a huge deal. And when I do that, I can usually start the clock again right away. And then the overall project of whatever I'm doing, whether it is less sugar or it's less time mindlessly watching Instagram reels or less swearing or less whatever, that project continues and progresses and builds. And those little blips remain little blips instead of becoming major disruptions. But when I'm in a perfectionistic mindset, sometimes that project never gets started because I just keep kicking the can down the road toward a flawlessly executed tomorrow that will never actually come. This is probably a really good time to just reiterate that the 50 things are a list of things that I have learned that I totally believe to be true and that I think are super helpful, but they are not things that I have necessarily mastered, and I have not mastered the reset in quite the way that I wish I had at this point. There are still plenty of days when the project is canceled, the day is ruined, perfection has been shattered, and it is just time to roll out the cherry sours, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But I still have come to believe that this whole capacity to accept imperfection and to move on from it pretty quickly, that's one of the keys to the kingdom, I think, in making any kind of change. While I was prepping for this episode, I was chatting with a friend of mine, and I mentioned all of this to him. And this perfectionism thing, I think it's a really common problem, because he said he too has wrestled with this tendency. He said that when he's really trying to eliminate something or limit something or whatever, he actually tallies his slip-ups day to day. And I can see how, for some people, this might feel punitive, but he told me that it actually ratchets down the pressure on him in some ways, and it normalizes his mistakes in a way. He doesn't catastrophize the slightest misstep. And he also gets motivation from the exercise of counting them up, comparing them to the day before or the week before, and just generally measuring them in a way that allows him to actually track progress even without perfection. And I think that's really smart. I might give that a whirl myself. Finally, one last thought on perfectionism, and that's that I've given up on it in terms of crafting this perfectly healthy life with regard to sugar and probably a lot of other things, because to be honest, the idea of leading a perfectly sugar-free life makes me want to die. It makes me want to die. So instead, I do a thing called Free Fridays. Friday is the day I go get my groceries anyway, so I let myself have pretty much whatever I want for lunch and dinner that day without thinking too much about it. And that includes something sweet, of course. I try to keep it mostly reasonable, but I really do find it easier to eat less sugar for the rest of the week when I know I will have ice cream on Friday if that's what I want. This way, I still get to have some of the seasonal treats also. Like I can have a Reese's pumpkin in October and those mini eggs at Easter time, or some of the cookies, strictly non-banana ones, that I make at Christmas. And that kind of sugar is sugar I don't really want to cut out anyway. And I think trying would just make it harder, in my opinion, to hold the line the rest of the time. And by the way, I do want to say that discussions about what to eat and how and whether to control diet, those are very personal. And I'm not saying that these approaches are right for everybody. I'm just saying that they have been helpful for me personally as I try to eat just a little less sugar some of the time. So sugar is my personal problem and my big hurdle when it comes to forming a habit of subtraction. And I think sugar is a problem for a lot of us, but maybe it isn't for you. You may be one of those extraordinary people who can just take or leave a slice of cheesecake or a piece of chocolate. And if so, please know that I regard you as an object of fascination and wonder, really. But there might be other things in your life that you're trying to reduce or remove, some other habit of subtraction you're trying to form. And if so, you might be able to adapt some of these ideas, or at the very least, you might find it helpful to think about the difference between adding something in versus taking something out. Because there are different challenges posed by each process, and it can be useful to kind of walk through them. I hope it is, anyway. Okay, quick execution score. 4 out of 10. Total train wreck. It is a bare-knuckle spiritual fight every single day of my life. But I guess I get the 4 points because at least I'm thinking more clearly about my strategies. And I do think that finally tossing the perfectionist thinking has been somewhat helpful to me along the way. So, a slower, slightly less catastrophic train wreck. And I think that's about enough out of me for today. If you are trying to stay out of the cookie jar or off of Instagram or, out of Target or whatever your version of a problem of subtraction is, I wish you fortitude and wiliness and whatever else it is we need as we fight these kinds of battles. Thanks for spending some time with me today. I'll be back next week with thing number 15.